you everyone for being here tonight. For those of you who don't know of us, Halachic Left is a grassroots movement of halachically observant Jews. We advocate for our communities to oppose Jewish supremacy, support ending the Israeli occupation, and to work towards a just and equitable future for Israelis and Palestinians. Tonight is very much part of that work. We're thrilled to have Peter Beinart, our first ever speaker, here with us this evening. I don't think he needs much introduction to this crowd, but he's currently the editor-at-large at Jewish Currents and most recently the author of Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. You can also subscribe to his Substack, the Beinart Notebook, for which we have a special discount code tonight. And moderating our conversation tonight is Gershon Rosenberg, a rising senior at SAR High School and summer intern here at Halachic Left. And he also goes to my shul. He's also the Mount Sinai Jewish Center in Washington Heights. He is also the author of an article in his student newspaper entitled SAR should encourage a broader understanding of the Gaza conflict, calling for broader, more thoughtful dialogue about the Gaza war. We're excited to have him leading the conversation tonight. With that, let's get started. Gershon, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Caroline. I'm going to ask a couple questions to Peter, just kind of frame the event, but I want this to be largely like a dialogue between Peter and the audience. That's going to be the goal. So you spoke to Halachic Left in this room about a year ago following Zoran's primary win. And a year later, the wins keep on coming. So what's your reaction to the recent primary?
Thank you. So first, just let me say how grateful I am to be here. The Halachic Left is... when people ask me, they sometimes people ask, like, where do you see hope, that kind of thing, or what gives me hope not only in Israel Palestine, but for the future of American Judaism? I always answer Halachic Left. And if Jonathan Sarna writes another edition of his book on American Judaism, I think it will include Halachic Left, because this work is of historical significance, not just for justice in Israel and Palestine, but for the moral and spiritual renewal of American Jewry. So it's really, I'm honored to be with you. I also wanted to say that I recognize that not everyone is going to agree with everything that I say. And if you're the person here in this room who most strongly disagrees with what I'm going to say, you're the person I'm most grateful is here. And I want to have the chance to listen to you and learn from you. The third thing I want to say is to thank my dear friend, EY, for letting us use the space, and to say that there will be another very significant event, in my opinion, this Shabbos here, which will be the inaugural meeting of Minyan Merchav, which will be the first Shabbat morning minyan on the Upper West Side that I am aware of that is committed not only to enthusiastic davening and serious study of Torah, but also the equality and dignity for all people, emphatically including Palestinians. So, if you will be on the Upper West Side for Shabbos,
I'm going to write the email address, which is minyanmerchav@gmail.com, and I'm going to write it out. And so, if you want to join us on Shabbat, we have a few spaces left, and you can email an RSVP, and we'll see you. And you can also camp out here if you'd like until then.
Right, and there'll be Kiddush, and it's going to be good. So. On your question, I think that, there's this famous line about the 5 stages of grief. And I think where we can see is that the forces in American politics and also in our community that are committed to unconditional U.S. support for Israel, I think have reached step 3. So I think 3 is denial, and I feel like I've been doing this. I see Eric Alterman in the background. He's also been doing this for long enough. You can remember that for a lot, it wasn't that long ago, right? That if you said to people, there are a lot of American Jews there are a lot of Americans who are really upset about what Israel's doing to Palestinians and others, and there are a lot of American Jews. People would say it's not true. Actually, support for Israel is deeply, deeply rooted among Americans of all. In fact, I really think Benjamin Netanyahu has really believed that for a long time, which is part of the reason he's been so cavalier about his relationship to American public opinion. But also, you just always see people say, 90% of American Jews, blah, 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 support Israel. I think that I hear that less now, and I think we have been up we've been more in the stage, I think, of anger, which is number 2, which is to say, who the heck are these people, right? Not that Jews who have these opinions don't exist, but that there are Jews who have these opinions, and how have we gone so terribly wrong that we now have Jews, particularly younger Jews, who have these opinions, and we need to trek from the Upper East Side, down to up to Washington Heights, or out to to Brooklyn to go talk to her. It's like that. You're not old enough to remember the Great Schlep, which was Sarah Silverman's idea, where people were going to go to speak to their boobies and zadies in Florida to get them to vote the right way in the 2000 presidential. Now it's the kind of reverse, right? You're going to go. The boobies and zadies are going to go to talk to their grandchildren or their children in Brooklyn to fix, to get them off TikTok and actually, reading, reading Alan Dershowitz and being set straight on this subject. But I think that, I think the Rahm Emanuel speech that at Tel Aviv University, I think was, for me, the clearest indication of some
people moving to the stage of 3, which is bargain it, right? So I think that speech was an effort at bargaining. It was basically to say, listen, I know that I need to move. I'm not, and this is I'm going to stake this space out and try to hold this new space. And I think it's a big deal. And I think the fact that the Democratic Majority for Israel, which is basically AIPAC's wing in the Democratic Party, basically said that it was a good speech. I didn't explicitly say he was wrong to call. What exactly Emmanuel was calling for is hard to tell a little bit. You have to, we don't have the Rashi on it yet. But it could mean more or less, depending on what he means by the phrase illegal settlements, for instance. But I think that what you're seeing is now, and there's going to be a divide between, I would say, kind of bitter ender folks who are
mostly more on the Trump side of the American Jewish establishment, and then the more centrist types who I think are going to try to say, they've already given up on the idea of military aid, right? Which was a kind of tactical concession to, what I don't know, the military metaphor is like, put your troops on higher ground to defend for them, right? Especially with the NDA, where you're trying to put the U.S. and Israeli militaries together so you don't need the military aid. But then the question is how they're going to respond to this idea of sanctions in the West Bank, I think is going to be a really, really interesting question. And I think it raises a lot of really interesting questions for people who have views like mine, which is, how do you strike the right balance between recognizing these are real victories and really important, and not being self-righteous, and not being purist, and not wagging your finger at people who came to views a little later than you might have, because I certainly have no standing to do that. There's a period in my life where I was to the right of where Rahm Emanuel is now. But on the other hand, there's also, I would say, if you read the Rahm Emanuel speech, you see that in some ways, even though the policy is moving in the right direction, the framework, the narrative framework, I think is still fundamentally wrong, basically. His narrative framework is basically, he's recognizing that Israel is hurting itself in terms of its standing internationally, and maybe acknowledging that Israel is doing some things that are morally problematic, but there's almost no discourse in that speech about the idea that Palestinians have a basic right to freedom. And the narrative he has in that speech, which is that basically starts with the idea that Palestinians deserve all the blame for the fact that Palestinians are being oppressed, I actually think if you stick with that narrative, sooner or later it's going to lead the policy in the wrong direction. So anyway, that's a longer answer, but those are some thoughts.
That was a long question. There was a lot of talk about a piece Ariel Angel wrote in Jewish Currents. She said, we need new Jewish institutions. We need them to carry our politics and also the other facets of our lives. We need them to discover who we are and to put this discovery to use in the world. We need them not to exit the Jewish community, but to join it in earnest on our own terms, to transition from pockets of rebellion to poles of power. And given how resource-intensive halachically observant infrastructure is compared to non-halachic infrastructure, does the institutional calculus change for the halachically observant left? Or do we have a responsibility to engage within existing spaces?
I mean, this cuts as someone who's spending with EY and others the last few weeks trying to figure out how we're going to deal with a double parsha this Shabbos and get enough laners. find the Sefer Torah and whatever. It's given me I felt actually been thinking about these questions a lot. I think that I think it is difficult we're not at the stage right now where it's possible in very many places to build full scale halachic left kind of institutions, camps, day schools, for instance, right? And even now with minyanim, you are getting there more and more, but the minyanim are under institutionalized, right? Now, I think there's a real possibility that within the coming years we might get to those places, but we're not. It's still. I think we're still in early days, even though there's a lot that's exciting about it. Now, I feel for me these developments are, I would say, bittersweet. On the one hand, I think they are absolutely to me part of a crucial moral and religious renewal that we're seeing among American Jews, particularly younger American Jews, which I think is the last time we saw something like this, I think was the kind of connected to the Chavurah movement and Breira and people who were coming out of the civil rights and anti-war movement. But it's bittersweet for me because I like the idea of davening and being in other Jewish religious spaces with people who disagree with me politically, and those relationships are precious to me. They've been long-standing relationships. I don't want to look around every room that I'm in and look up from my sitter and see that everyone has the same, is reading Jewish currents when they should be listening to the Haftarah. I'd be happy if, some people are reading commentary while, instead of, I think that I really have felt like personally I've benefited a lot from that kind of diversity, but I will be honest that I found it's become harder. It's become significantly harder since October 7th. And so on the one hand, I think that if you're in an institution that is precious to you, where you feel accepted enough, I think it is absolutely fine, better than fine, to stay in that institution and do your political work somewhere else. But there are also moments that people feel like that the limitations of those institutions or the outright hostility of the institutions become not just a moral problem, but a religious problem, right? An ability to actually encounter God in the way and Torah in the way you want. And I also think that I understand that. And I think that, there is I sometimes worry that what's happening as the mainstream institutions become more aware of the fact that public opinion is moving in the other direction, that instead of moving in the way that Rahm Emanuel is moving, or even at times things Elliot Cosgrove has said, which is like, let me try to learn about these strange kind of tribe that seems to exist and actually doesn't, and like Zohar Mamdani. That I also see a lot of this kind of defensiveness and basically saying like, we're under siege. We're going to become even less open to the internal conversation because the barbarians are at the gates. And I think that's very unfortunate.
Yeah. As you touched on, it's very challenging to be in community with people whom you have strong disagreements. So how large should the Jewish tent be, and how do we sustain it?
I mean, I think it depends on what particular institution you're trying to build. I mean, the Jewish tent, if the Jewish tent means people who are Jews, then Itamar Ben-Gvir is obviously in the Jewish tent. I mean, and I suppose that if Itamar Ben-Gvir were saying Kaddish and he needed a 10th person, I would say Kaddish, with him, and vice versa. I would hope. Maybe I don't know if he would with me, but God willing, I won't be in that situation for a while. But so I think it depends on you to do what in what space, right? But on the other hand, I would also. I mean, I guess there could be a conflict between my willingness to. I mean, I would like to have Itamar Ben-Gvir be the 10th person for Kaddish, but I would also like to see him arrested. To have due process. I mean, I think he deserves. He's not necessarily a big fan of giving Palestinians due process, but I think he very much deserves due process. under international law. So these, I think, those are challenges. It depends on what the purpose is and what the space is. And then I think the shape of the tent depends on what you're actually trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to turn to some questions we got from the audience. What's one important question about Israel Palestine that you're still uncertain about?
That's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of things that I'm still uncertain about, and that I think that I think there are a lot of very thoughtful and serious critiques of the view that I take. And if the view that I take is that I believe in the principle of equality under the law everywhere. I believe all states should treat people equally, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, race. And I don't believe in policies that try to maintain demographic majorities of people of a particular racial, ethnic, religious group in Hungary, in France, in the United States, anywhere. Sorry? I don't believe it in Louisiana. I think that I believe that under equality under the law in states that have very diverse populations, those collectivities can be reflected, right? Canada has English and French as languages, right? And so you can have communal autonomy. People want to educate their children in French in Quebec. That's fine as long as everyone's living under equality, with equality under the law. I think that a serious critique of that argument is that it doesn't take either Jewish nationalism or Palestinian nationalism seriously enough as forces. That it is a position which is a kind of, in some ways, the kind of position that people like Brit Shalom were taking in the 1930s and 1940s. And the critique then was that they didn't have a constituency on either side. And I think the critique now would be, you don't actually have a real constituency on either side. And I would grant, and certainly there's not a constituency right now among Israeli Jews for that now. Which is not surprising, because under conditions of supremacy, groups are always going to want to basically maintain that supremacy unless they encounter resistance that forces them to come up with a plan B, C, or D. But in some ways, the more compelling challenge is, does it have a constituency among Palestinians? Or do what Palestinians really want is a Palestine, right? And they might be more willing to concede on the size of the Palestine than of the fact that it has to be Palestine. Right? And what Palestine means, for me, I don't believe that most of the Palestinians that I know, I would say virtually all the Palestinians that I know, when they think of Palestine, they don't mean a place where Jews don't have basic human rights. I mean, I know people will think I have 7 heads when I say that, but I'm usually feel frustrated because I'm usually looked at as like criminally, traitorously naive by people, as far as I can tell, who don't interact very much with Palestinians under conditions where they could actually listen to them. And I actually do listen to Palestinians on these questions a lot. I talk to them a lot. And it's very, very, very rare that I encounter people who say, I don't think Jews should be allowed to live here, practice their religion, do whatever they want. Right?
Could you name one Palestinian?
No. We'll have time for question and answers. And I'm happy, and I'm glad you're here. And I will answer whatever you want to say. But I do think there is another point, which is to say, is there a tolerance for the idea of representation of a collective Jewish identity, right? Because there is a decolonial attitude which says, and it's not a crazy argument, right? It's just not my position, that this place should have become Palestine in 1948. Just like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, it should have been, that was the colonial intervention prevented it from becoming Palestine. It should become Palestine again. And there can be Jews in Palestine, but it's Palestine. And you're not going to equate the identity of the settler population with the indigenous native population, and that's a critique of binationalism. That's a critique of and what that really means is that you have to get to the place of thinking that there will be Palestinian Jews, a large Palestinian Jewish population. I don't think that is a realistic way of thinking, and I don't think it reflects I don't think it honors the self-conception of Israeli Jews that exist as a collectivity. But that is a view that has strength in Palestinian solidarity circles, right? I mean, if you look at DSA's statement on what about it wants, it's interesting. What it says is it wants is a sovereign Palestine. right? It doesn't say what the borders are, but it says sovereign Palestine. It's actually not what Mamdani says. What Mamdani says, I think, is closer to what I say, which is, I want a state which provides equality under the law. But saying you want a sovereign Palestine is somewhat different in this regard. And I think that is a critique of my position. And one of the things it's hard because Israel and America have not allowed Palestinian politics to actually play out in a legitimate democratic way. In some ways, it's hard to know where these things would settle, but it is possible they would settle in a way that suggests that my views are they were the views of Edward Said before he died. Said believed in this, but Said also, by the time he embraced those views, was out of step with the mainstream. Arafat was banning his books by the time he wrote that essay in the New York Times Magazine in 2000. So I think that's a serious critique, and it might be something that at some point I have to grapple with and revise my views.
On the topic of a binational state, someone wrote in, is the notion that Jews would be unsafe under a one-state solution a genuine fear or a product of Islamophobia, or both, or perhaps both?
I think both. I think it is. I think we just need to sometimes important to de-exceptionalize this. And think about how other groups of people who become accustomed to a kind of group supremacy tend to think about the prospect of equality. And I think the norm is they tend to equate equality with death, or at least with subjugation. As someone who spent a fair amount of my childhood in South Africa, I can tell you that it was considered at least as obvious among white South Africans as it is among Israeli and other Jews that if you had a government that brought a black government that was a black majority, it was a much larger black majority actually, that if you had a black government, that white people would basically be murdered. It was actually like almost considered not worth even arguing about. It was so obvious. I quote in my book Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader in Northern Ireland, on the eve of the Good Friday Accords, where Catholics get political equality, and he calls it a prelude to genocide. It was commonplace in the 19th century in America for people to say, white Americans to say something along the lines of, if we don't have slaves, we will be the slaves, right? So I think that's just a normal way that people who have grown up in a supremacist environment think. I think the fear is genuine, very genuine, but I also think it's conditioned by a certain way of having been taught about the other and that it's very difficult. Even when you notice the way people use the word, you kind of liberal Zionists, listen to the way they use the word power. They say, we are now in an era of Jewish power. And then they may say, we should use that power responsibly, right? That's the leftward move. But they're using power as a synonym for supremacy, right? They're not, American Jews have power. We have a significant amount of power, not total power, not supremacy, but we have some power. Australian Jews have power, right? They're using the word power when they mean supremacy, which I think is, again, part of this discourse. Now, I think that what's fascinating is when you look at the way that people who are legal inferiors think about what equality under the law means, right? Because what they see, which I think is more accurate, is that legal equality may not change nearly as much as people think it will change, right? If you go, I don't know how many times any of you spent time in post-apartheid South Africa. In some ways, post-apartheid South Africa is a radically different country. But if you drive from the airport in Cape Town, where my parents were from, and you drive through shanty towns, which are 100% black, and then you go to the place like Sea Point, right, where my grandmother grew up and my grandmother lived, you will feel like not that much has changed, right? In fact, that's part of the reason apartheid ended. Because white elites in South Africa realized that they could actually give black people the vote and life would not change that dramatically. And go to Atlanta, right? I mean, in some ways, Atlanta is a radically different city than it was in 1960. In some ways, the dynamics look similar. So I think the point is that actually this is another critique of my point. One of the reasons that you see some in the Palestine Solidarity movement not, giving, let's say, 2 cheers, but not 3 cheers for the idea of equality under the law and wanting to talk more about a decolonial discourse is precisely because they may believe that equality under the law actually isn't going to bring the kind of, it could leave you with still a vast Palestinian underclass, basically, and Israeli Jews having vastly disproportionate economic power, which translates into political power. We see it all over the world. We see it here, how economic power translates into political power. So I think it's really hard for people who are in this supremacy-based kind of prism to actually see it from that side, even though I think that side, there's actually more truth to that conception about what would happen.
Circling back to whether or not we should have new Jewish institutions, someone wrote in, can new Jewish institutions negotiate with established ones and each other on important topics like defining anti-Semitism, or are permanent schisms inevitable?
I hope so. I mean, I think it would be great to have a dialogue between, folks at Halachic left and folks at KJ. Choose a place at random, or Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, or Lincoln Square. I genuinely, and I think part of the reason I think that's not impossible to imagine, maybe not formally but informally, is I imagine there are folks here who grew up going to those very shuls and have family members, parents, or those who go. And so, in some ways, I think what's so fascinating about this moment is that on the formal, official level, it's like no. This is treif, right? We don't talk to treif, right? But I think on the informal level, anyone who knows the Jewish world intimately and knows that in many, many, many of these communities and many, many of these families, that the very position that is considered not just wrong but anti-Semitic is also now held by someone at the Seder table, right? Or someone at the Shabbos table. And so the conversation in a way is happening. And I think that's part of the reason that people like you have tremendous power, right? Have a lot of influence to gradually have an impact, right? Eugene McCarthy, famously, he ran against Lyndon Johnson in 1968 because his kids asked him to, because his kids were anti-war activists, right? And I think so whether someone is going to give a lecture to that conversation publicly, I think the private conversation can really have an impact over time.
I want to turn to questions from the audience.
Can I start collecting questions, please? Thank you. So I'm going to start off while I guess. Let me get some questions. And so I'm going to read the first one while I stand over here and they get past me. It's chaos. So the first question we have, and I see we're getting some questions about books, is assessment of Shaul Magid's work, especially his counter-Zionism, and ideas about Jewish identity and the Holocaust. I'm not sure if that's two or one, but I'll let you decipher that.
I love Shaul. He's one of my favorite people in the world. I think he's doing incredible stuff. I think the project. I just think he's a really unique, important figure in Jewish studies. In thinking about the different kind of anti-Zionisms and how they could be in conversation with each other. The work he's doing on kind of Satmar anti-Zionism, I think is really, really fascinating and important. I will say that I haven't never totally, and I said this because I was on a conversation, never totally understood what he meant by counter-Zionism. And I remember thinking when he said counter-Zionism, that I was thinking is counter-Zionism counter-Semitism, right? Is it like, what is the difference between counter-Zionism and anti-Zionism? I'm not really sure, but I think, I'm not sure it's really that important in assessing his work. I think his work is really, really valuable. And I think his life experience is really, really important because he's lived a lot of in some ways he's lived a lot of the American Jewish experience from the, kind of Jewish Defense League to Baal Tshuva and kind of, Hasidic stuff. So, on the Holocaust in Israel, those are big topics. I don't know if there was any more specificity about my thoughts about the Holocaust in Israel? I don't know really how I can answer that because I'm not sure I could gloss fairly, Shaul's thoughts about Israel and the Holocaust on one foot. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Just want to give a big thumbs up to the work that he's done on the Satmar and Karta, and that I actually think that's something that should be revisited because of how the Karta has been showing up and how they're so misunderstood, and especially, and he did a great work going back to how the understanding.
Right.
Exactly what he said. All right, so on a completely different topic.
Yeah.
We want to know somebody would like to know about advice, and you're thinking more globally about people who are pro-Palestinian and what support you can give to Christians who are called anti-Semitic, and how Jews, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, how folks, diverse folks can come together to support each other to think about this issue.
I think it's a really important question. I think that it seems to me there are a lot of things in common in the kind of the way in which a kind of worship of the state of Israel has eclipsed or become a kind of substitute Judaism in so many Jewish spaces. So it's just like, to state the obvious that in many, many Jewish spaces in the United States and around the world, the test of whether you are a Jew in good standing is not, whether you keep Shabbos or whether you keep kosher or whether you give tzedakah or you wash the bodies of the dead or you visit mourners. It's basically whether you fight BDS and fight Zoran Mamdani and unconditionally support Israel. And I think that there are a lot of I think there are interesting parallels with what you see in India, where this kind of religious nationalism of Hindutva has become, for many people, it seems to me, what Hinduism is. And in American Christians, conservative white American Christians, where it seems to be that there's a worship of the state and a worship of the figure of Donald Trump. And, I'm not an expert on Christianity, but I thought it had a universal moral message. And I see these self-proclaimed, these big Christian people acting like if you don't have an American passport, if you have the wrong, document in your pocket, then basically you're worthless, right? And, you should be shipped off to die. So again, I think there's something about this moment that is leading people to turn nationalism and ethnonationalism in particular into a kind of an idol in different religious traditions, and we can learn from one another. I know that folks, for instance, in the Hindu community who are in actually a weaker position in a lot of ways than we are, have been trying to look to Jews on the left as a model for thinking about how they respond to Hindutva. And I think that especially when it comes to Christians, I think the kind of people in this room who are Jewish have a really, really, really important role to play. I think that to me, one of the tragedies is that, I think the more decent a person you are, the more seriously as a Christian you take the history of Christian anti-Semitism, the more you tremble at the thought of being called anti-Semitic, because you understand how deeply complicit your tradition was in that. And then the leadership of our community takes that really beautiful desire to be humble about your own blindness vis-a-vis and your desire to make a tikkun for what your ancestors may have done, and then weaponizes it and turns it into a defense of oppression and of even of genocide. I mean, it's a horrifying move to make. And I think we need to talk to Christians and say, it's good that you are alert to the possibility that you could be anti-Semitic, there may be tropes that you have picked up, just as I have picked up tropes about all kinds of other, that we all do, right? That I, as a man, as a white person, all these things, that I should be humble about this. But don't forget the basic core principle here of why anti-Semitism is wrong. Anti-Semitism is wrong because bigotry is wrong, right? It is a particular species of of bigotry, but it is bigotry. And the core principle is that Jews should be treated equally with other people, right? And if Jews should be treated equally, it also means that Palestinians should be treated equally. And so don't lose sight of that core principle, because what these people are trying to do is they're trying to play on your genuine concern about anti-Semitism to get you to abandon this core moral principle of the idea that human beings are created in the image of God and deserve equality under the law. And they're trying to turn you into a defender of supremacy in the name of opposing bigotry, which is completely Orwellian. Again, equality is not bigotry. Equality is the antithesis of bigotry.
We got someone who wrote, granted Israel is an apartheid state, why aren't we focusing on other non-democracies in the same way? Why is the U.S. so invested in just this one issue?
It's a great question. I think you can answer it a few ways. The most obvious way is to talk about the depth of American complicity in this subject, right? That I am more responsible for what is done with my money than I'm responsible for things that are not done with my money, right? And Israel has, the United States, there have been periods where the U.S. has put a lot of money into Ukraine or Afghanistan, but in general, year over year, decade over decade, going back to 1967, Israel has gotten far more money from the U.S. than any other place. We've given, I think, maybe $20 billion in addition to the normal allocations since October 7th. There's really no other country that comes close, and there's no other country that comes close in terms of also the amount of energy America puts into shielding Israel under international law. The only country that America focuses as much on shielding from international law as Israel is the United States. So I think that's one answer. But the second answer which is also important to say, is that people have the right to focus on the moral questions that speak to them and they have a particular concern about, right? If someone is desperately concerned about, animal rights, do I turn to them and say, why are you not more focused on the question of lack of housing, right? I mean, the point is, the most important question, people have for all kinds of complicated reasons focus on one thing or another, right? The point is, I'm grateful when someone actually tries to do anything in pursuit of the idea of justice and freedom and equality, right? And so I don't think we usually look at people who are focusing on human rights abuses in Tibet and say, I don't know, you seem very unconcerned about Zimbabwe, right? We say, good for you, you got off your tuchas, you're doing something about Tibet. You could just be watching the World Cup, or I don't know, I mean, so it's like, so I think in some ways it's I think it's also, I also find that if you really are concerned about some of there's a category of people who I notice only seem to ever discuss Sudan or Syria or Myanmar, when they want to, because they're upset someone else is talking about Israel. So what I would say to those people is, if you're concerned about Sudan, fabulous. God bless you. There's a lot of work to be done in Sudan. And if you try to think about what we need to do to change U.S. policy vis-a-vis Sudan, it's actually not going to be as simple for you as you think, right? Because one of the key, most crucial bad actors in Sudan is the United Arab Emirates, right? In terms of actually who's fueling the bloodshed in Sudan, right? Which is Israel's closest ally now in the Arab world, right? So if you want to go down a rabbit hole and try to think about what we should do in that soon, I think that's terrific, right? But I think you're actually going to find that you run into some of the same questions about the way America sells arms around the world, the way America undermines international law, that in that context that you're going to find in the Israel-Palestine context.
Is changing the narrative within the Jewish community part of changing reality on the ground in the land? Or is it just for the sake of the Jewish community's soul?
I think it is for the sake of the Jewish community soul, but I also think it has a material impact because the American Jewish community, the organized American Jewish community remains a very powerful player in this discourse. It's not omnipotent and all-powerful. I don't think that we abducted, Nicolas Maduro because AIPAC wanted that to happen. And there are people on the left and on the right who literally say that. I mean, I don't have, Marjorie Taylor Greene just kind of suggested a few days ago that she thinks that AIPAC is behind the rape allegations against Graham Plattner. I mean, I think there are people who are going a little bit crazy with this, right? AIPAC is guilty of enough bad things. You don't have to invent bad things that they did, right? They're not, whatever. They're not responsible for the fact that, that the Patriots have had trouble finding a really good wide receiver in recent years. But I think but I do think that if you look particularly inside the Democratic Party, the organized American Jewish community has been very important in preventing, and now it's beginning to change, but for a very long time, what you had was a big gap between Democratic politicians and Democratic public opinion, right? A little bit less of a gap in the Republican Party, where I think AIPAC was not quite as necessary because, again, this has all been changing just in the last year, but there was a very strong basis of support, public support for Israel in the Republican Party. But for quite a few years now, there hasn't really been nearly as much in the Democratic Party. There has been fairly widespread support to ending unconditional support for Israel in the Democratic Party, and yet it's only very recently that Democratic politicians have started moving in that direction. And I think the reason we haven't had that transmission mechanism from public opinion in the Democratic Party to politicians, again, until quite recently, is in significant measure because of groups like AIPAC that intervene very strategically and effectively in campaigns, and also intervene in and other organizations intervene in the kind of discursive space to make most politicians are people who basically want to get reelected, and this is not their particular issue. And if you make the cost high enough to them. And so their view is it's going to be a real pain in the ass for me if I say something which is out of line. They're just not going to do it. Now what we're seeing is that now it's turning out to be a real pain in the ass for them if they try to take the AIPAC line too. So they're being caught between these two things. But that's relatively recent. I think this shift would have happened earlier if it were not for groups like AIPAC and the ADL and the whole panoply of these organizations.
How should we approach Jewish community leaders about Israel Palestine? How do we have those conversations?
I mean, the first thing is that I think that I hope and believe that many of you will become Jewish community leaders. So we don't, and maybe already are becoming those things. And that fills me with a great deal of hope and excitement. When it comes to Jewish community leaders who don't have a set of views like the Halachic left does, I think that I think it's really valuable to talk to people, and to listen to them, and to listen seriously and carefully, and to honor their experiences and try to understand the experiences that they have had that have led them to their views. But I also think it's valuable to talk about the experiences that you've had. And I think if I had to, I think the one thing that I again and again find is most determinative of how people see this issue is the extent of the human interaction they've had with Palestinians. And so I think talking about what you saw when you went to Masafer Yato or Sheikh Jarrah, or the experience you had of watching a film or talking to a Palestinian friend or reading a book, I think is really important. And then the next step is to just, in as kind as a way, but as nudgy a way as you can, is to say, listen, you as a leader need to have this experience yourself in the way that works for you, and you need to expose your community to this. It is not, you can't go and tell your community that you're informing them about Israel, this territory, a territory where more than half the people who live under Israeli control are Palestinian, and not also educate them about Palestinians. And it seems to me once you start to unlock that, a lot changes.
Can you speak a bit to the New York City election results and what, if anything, you think they indicate about the role the Jewish left and the pro-Palestinian movement have come to play in city politics? What can we learn from this?
I think, there were polls that suggested that Mamdani won a third of the Jewish vote. There are people who suggested that number was low because they were only, the polling with Jews has this issue about whether you ask people their religion, right? Because we have this group of people who will answer no religion, but then if you ask them if they're Jewish, they'll say yes. And that maybe is, especially among younger people, that's higher. Those people tend to be further to the left. I've seen some suggest that because those people weren't included, it could be higher. But I would say if the number is a third, it kind of roughly tracks with what I think the polling generally shows in terms of basically which Jews have views that are, just put it colloquially, off the derech, right? The polling shows basically that you have somewhere between 25 and, you have probably somewhere in the ballpark of 25, a third, 40%, depending on how you ask the question, of Jews who answered that question. And among younger people, it gets up to about 50. So we had a poll a couple weeks ago that showed that I think 51% of American Jews under the age of 35 who aren't Orthodox said they prefer a binational state, right, over a Jewish state. The polling on genocide, tends to show that you have not a majority of Jews who say they believe Israel has committed genocide, but I think the Washington Post poll last fall, I think it had it at 39%. I think there was another poll that I just saw recently that I think it was in the 30s. So I think that this is where the numbers seem to land. And so I think from this perspective, I don't think that, I think the percentage on who we call Israel apartheid state is probably a little bit higher than that. So I think it's not surprising that would be what you would find with the Mamdani election, because he became a kind of stand-in for this view, for basically a view that says, you can call it anti-Zionist, you can basically say, a lot depends on also how you phrase this question, right? I always like to often cite this poll that Mira Sukharov, the Canadian political scientist, did, where she asked American Jews if they consider themselves Zionists. But she did something that the legacy Jewish organizations almost never do, which is she gave different definitions of Zionism. So when she asked American Jews, are you a Zionist if it means a strong commitment, a strong connection to the land of Israel, the vast majority of people said yes. When she said, are you a Zionist if it means a Jewish and democratic state? Most people said yes. But when she said, are you a Zionist if it means that Jews have superior rights to Palestinians? Most American Jews said no, right? So a lot also depends on how these questions are framed. And I think one of the things that Mamdani did really well was he repeatedly went back to the basic principle, right? People were trying to get, obviously all these kind of rhetorical crap questions, and he kept going back to the principle. I believe that states should treat people equally under the law. And I think there is a lot of support among American Jews for that position, even among people who would call themselves Zionists, right? And then the question is, to what degree is Zionism reconcilable with that? And I think that's where you can have a really, really important conversation. But I think he, in some ways, was able to get to that core position, which is a lot of position that many, many American Jews hold, because after all, that's what we want here.
If one has the option to attend a halachic left-wing tefillah space and a more mainstream tefillah space, that's at the very least not unfriendly to them, or equally easy for both, is there a value in remaining in the mainstream one?
I mean, that's difficult. You haven't told me anything about the Kiddush. You haven't, do they allow talking during davening? I mean, are they using Koran? Are they using Art Scroll? Are they using, there are a lot of questions here that go into these kind of things, right? How long is the Torah? I would say, I don't think I think this is an individual personal decision. I think that I totally respect and understand people who say, given the magnitude of what Israel is doing and what Israel supporters are doing for me in terms of my relationship with God, I want to be in a space where I feel like people are living out this basic idea of believing that all human beings are created in the image of God and that we should treat them that way. But I also completely understand people who might say, you know what, there are a lot of other things I love about this space. My parents went here. I grew up here. It's important to me. I have a real connection here. I don't want to be in a political echo chamber. I can do halachic events, on Monday and Thursday, and I don't know. You guys don't have, you guys don't read Torah on Monday and Thursdays, probably. But you could, and on Shabbos I'm going to go to this place. I think that's also totally fine. I would say I think your life is more than just politics, right? So I think it's legitimate to basically tend to different aspects of your life, and you can do political work other days that are in the spirit of halachic left. And if there's something that's very precious to you about a community, again, if you feel accepted enough in the space that you feel like it can be the religious experience that you want, or maybe if you also think that you could have an impact on the people there, I think it's totally fine.
A lot of work within the Jewish left is about reclaiming Judaism and trying to show that true Judaism and Torah is different and actually has different values than the classic extremist Zionism, right-wing narrative. Is this valuable, and is it scalable?
Is what valuable?
About reclaiming Judaism and trying to show that true Judaism and Torah is different.
So I think that we can comfortably say that true Judaism is not Zionism, but I think we also have to admit that true Judaism is not necessarily anti-Zionism either, right? These are just Judaism is something far too vast and ancient and multivocal to put it in the category of a kind of modern political nationalist movement or any political movement. I think it would be like saying, is Judaism left-wing or right-wing, right? The answer is both and neither, right? And so to me, I think there's always a danger on the left, as there is on the right, to basically say, I happen to, the Torah lines up perfectly with my political views. If that's the case, why do you need Torah, right? The point is there is a part of what's valuable about an ancient, vast religious tradition in some ways precisely because it confronts you with otherness, with this amazing but weird experience of seeing something that, on the one hand, you feel connected to, you're the inheritor of, and on the other hand, it sounds like crazy talk. Really, it's like, it's crazy. It sounds bizarre. There's obviously, many of you studied Talmud. There's lots of stuff in Talmud that's just completely nuts. right? From our perspective, not just morally, but just in terms of all kinds of basic assumptions about how the world works. And that's part of what makes it valuable. It's an amazing thing to be able to, in 2026, encounter a text, redacted in whatever, the 7th, 8th century, and say, this is mine. I'm connected to this, but it's from a completely different world. So I think that to me, the more honest thing to say politically is to say, Judaism speaks in many, many different voices. I have to have some meta principle that determines which of these voices I'm going to elevate and which I'm not, right? Not going to ignore the other ones. But so if for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, maybe the meta principle is that anything that facilitates the conquest of the land, right, is that's the most important principle. You judge everything against that. For me, and I didn't come up with this. I mean, this is nothing. I mean, I'm not, I think if you look at Abraham Joshua Heschel, right, it would probably be something more about the idea that that Torah begins with all human beings being created in the image of God, even before you get to the proto-Jewish story, right? That the first covenant is not a Jewish covenant, right? It's the covenant with Noah. And so I think that, some people might say that the central meta principle is the way we think about the lessons of bondage and exodus from Egypt. I think none of these things are right or wrong. They are decisions one makes, and some people are willing to acknowledge that they make those decisions, and other people pretend that they don't make those decisions. But in fact, I think my view is that in some form or another, everybody does.
Okay, do folks want to raise their hands to ask questions?
Just
Yeah.
To continue that question, that was my question. I think it was down in the middle. But that was great. But then, is there a point when pretty much all the communal leaders and religious leaders and communal and religious institutions disagree and say that, no, this is actually what true Judaism is and what the Torah is really saying, and taking this other perspective is either heretical or outside of the red lines of the community, then at some point does that win, and does Judaism become Zionism purely because you're fighting up against all the religious and communal leaders and institutions, and then it's kind of like a fool's errand to just try to say, no, we actually have the real interpretation. And
I think it's a great question. I think that because these questions have to do with what authority does one have, right? I mean, and we do have a tradition. It's not Protestantism, right, where you just pick up, you pick up you go straight to the text and you say, I read the verse. Maybe I'm not being fair to Protestants, and it always seems to me is like, this is what I believe it means. No, that's not the way we study Jewish texts. Like we say, no, hold on, buddy, right? Like see what centuries and centuries of people have said about these texts, and then enter into there, recognizing that like the terms of debate have been sketched out here a little bit. It started, for more than 1,000 years. But I think it's important to distinguish between that idea, right, which is like say, this stuff about milk and meat, it doesn't work for me, right? Like, I think that's going to be a problem, right? We have a very, very long tradition about interpreting. I just think, I'm not going to boil the calf in its mother's milk. No problem, right? Like, no, like you need to engage with a very old, very deep kind of way of thinking. But I think it's important to distinguish that from the kind of political discourse that I think most communal leaders are engaged in, right? Which is, I think, not really a halachic discourse generally, right? I think to me, it is in some ways a substitution of that entire discourse about Judaism and the replacement of it with a nationalist, ethno-nationalist discourse, which then eclipses Judaism. And I will say, like, I listened to a number of statements by high-profile rabbis about why they don't like Zohar Mamdani. And I would say some of what upset me and depressed me the most about those statements was that they were given as Divrei Torah. I really wish they had not. And I will just say, it was not good Torah. It just was not, it wasn't. They were just, the Torah was so thin that it was such an obvious example of a fact that you were not engaging in a genuine kind of understanding of trying to understand. And, you were basically, you were throwing in a little Torah to sprinkle it on basically what was your ethno-nationalist political agenda. Now, if you wanted to say, like, you wanted to go, and think about the discourse about the 3 oaths in Talmud and traditional halachic discourses about the legitimacy of going up to the land by force, and look at how religious nationalists dealt with that, going, from Rav Kook and many other people, and then going and looking at Shaul's work on the Satmar Rebbe. I mean, that's great. Like, do that. But then I think you're going to actually have lots of room to run.
Okay, we got another question. Do you think that mainstream Jewish institutions will eventually take the stance that they were always against this if public opinion on Israel continues to trend negative?
I think it's a great question. I actually did a conversation with Omer El-Akkad, who wrote a book with those famous words that one day everyone will always believe against this. And I think that maybe I'm butchering it a little bit, but one day everyone will always have been against this. I think sometimes yes and sometimes no. I mean, one of the points that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes a lot in his work is that actually, he was very skeptical of Barack Obama's use of king to say that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. I mean, do most Americans go around thinking how terrible it is that their ancestors didn't oppose the genocide of Native Americans? I mean, that would be considered that's a kind of pretty radical woke position to take, to say that we should have any kind of public apology or acknowledgement of that. So partly it depends who wins, good, good quote, one of the things that Ta-Nehisi wrote is he quotes Tony Judt talking about how utterly brutal the ethnic cleansing of ethnic Germans was from many countries in Eastern Europe, and how the fact that there's been no kind of historical acknowledgement of that whatsoever. So I think that in some ways it really depends. It depends on how the politics play out. It depends on whether we are able to change the power dynamics in society, and if that's successful, then yes, maybe more people will ultimately come to that view. But I think it's very, very, very much an open question.
And do you think we're going to be able to change the narrative on the destruction of Gaza?
I mean, I think the narrative is changing. I think it's changing faster than I would have imagined, both in a lot of different spaces on the right and the left. I think then the question kind of is going to become, I mean, I think there are new frontiers that are going to emerge in terms of what this reckoning means, right? I think that I think a lot really depends on how the American political establishment and the American Jewish establishment responds to this moment. I think if what Rahm Emanuel is suggesting, I think, is that the way to respond to this moment and to try to prevent the people like Zohar Mamdani, who basically want a full-scale arms embargo and who ultimately want to move Israel from being a Jewish state to being a state that provides equality for all its citizens, is to basically try to force Israel to try to actually be willing to contemplate to move in the direction of a Palestinian state. But I don't know if I don't know if the American Jewish establishment and the kind of leaders of the Democratic Party and Republican Party will be able to get to the place where they're really able to do that. And I also don't know if they will be able to convince to get Israel to that position. I mean, it would be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what the results of the elections are in this environment. And under the best case scenario, you have someone who's not Benjamin Netanyahu and hopefully not Naftali Bennett, maybe someone like Gadi Eisenkot, who is prime minister. And Gadi Eisenkot looks around at the world in a little bit the way that Mikhail Gorbachev and F.W. de Klerk looked at the world and says, this is not the direction I want to go, right? But as people say, like, when your horse dies, you dismount, right? That like the people, F.W. de Klerk was not a radical. He didn't want to dismantle apartheid. He saw that apartheid couldn't keep going. But the question is, we have a long way to go, I think, to put an Israeli politician in that position. It would take much more than just a few sanctions on some radical settler organizations. It would take not just an end to military aid. It would take Israel's recognition that it's not going to be able to buy enough American weapons to continue to do in Gaza and Lebanon and the West Bank, and it would require probably the Europeans ending their free trade agreement with Israel, which would have a very serious and maybe also saying that that the international that people have to worry seriously about prosecution if they're going to travel around the world. Maybe then you put them in that position, and then maybe then that becomes a fallback position, and they say, this is how we're going to save Zionism, right? We're going to save Zionism by basically, I think if you were a really wise American Jewish leader, you might say, the person who's going to save Zionism for me is Marwan Barghouti. He supposedly still supports a two-state solution. No, if you were from the position of the American Jewish establishment, it's not my position, right? Even if there were a two-state solution, I would still want the Jewish state and the Palestinian state to treat everybody equally under the law, right? But you could say, we're afraid of crazy people like Beinart, and, we don't want that. And so we're going to try to basically go to Marwan Barghouti, let him create a legitimate Palestinian political process, have elections, rebuild the PLO, allow Hamas to be part of an umbrella organization, and negotiate on that basis and offer Palestinians a sovereign state virtually near the 1967 lines, and in keeping with the Arab Peace Initiative. Maybe that's one scenario. I think we're a long way from that happening.
What do you think about the anti-Zionist right? How should we talk about it? Is it mainly motivated by anti-Semitism?
I'll answer that question. I want to make sure we get to this gentleman because he's I know he has strong feelings. I think that the anti-Zionist, the problem, there are some people on the anti-Zionist right, if you want to call them that, who are doing important things in some of what they're doing. So Tucker Carlson is putting quite a lot of Palestinians on his program. He's probably doing a better job of platforming. He's doing a better job of platforming Palestinians than the mainstream media. And he's not putting on Palestinians who come on to talk about how they hate Jews, right? Not at all. The Palestinians who he interviews, like Munter Isaac, just basically talk about what they've experienced. They basically say, this is what it's like. Now, it's true. They are mostly Christian. And that is problematic because in some ways it's Carlson not really being willing to break with the Islamophobia, which is so hegemonic. But it's also a savvy political tactic when you're talking to people who really care about being Christian to say, listen, you big Christians, what about these Palestinian Christians? What's happening to them, right? The problem with the discourse is on the anti-Zionist right is that it's often devoted to maintaining a certain American purity. So basically, it's willing to say Israel is bad, Zionism is bad, but it wants to maintain a kind of exceptionalist, kind of pure discourse about America. And that's where things get problematic, because then instead of seeing that what Israel is doing is part of certain features that exist in people of all different backgrounds, all different races and religions and ethnicities, including our own, and being able to think about the similarities between ethnonationalism in Israel and the ethnonationalism here, that's very difficult for someone like Tucker Carlson to do because he is an ethno-nationalist here, right? I mean, the irony is like he's now in this weird position where like he still wants America to have Israel's immigration policy, right? Which is to not allow people in who would challenge the demographic majority. And he does, and for him to talk about the genocide, he can talk about genocide in Gaza, which is good, but to talk about genocide of Native Americans is woke, right? And so what that leads you to, I think, is an exceptionalizing of Israel and Jews in ways that are problematic. And if you listen to Tucker Carlson, and as my partner to tell you, I listen for my sins like obsessively to Tucker Carlson. You hear him say a lot of things that I think I would agree with, and I think a lot of people would agree with. And then you hear him in a particular phrase go in a direction, and you're like, oh, we've taken a strange turn here. I'm not sure, I was on board a lot of stuff. I'm not sure I believe that Israel was involved in the Kennedy assassination. And you hear him say things that suggest that basically Israel is acting in an un-Christian way. Or there are things about, he gets into weird stuff he gets into very weird territory where he's talking about Chabad and the rebuilding of the temple. And the thing that he says, which is the giveaway often in Carlson, is, and I'm not even getting to Candace Owens because that's like another Madrega of crazy. Which I don't listen to. I'm not that masochistic. But Carlson will often say Israel's real enemy is the West. Israel's real enemy is America and Europe, the white Christian world. So he'll say what Israel really wants to do is create a global war in the Middle East that produces masses of refugees that destabilize Christian Europe and America, right? Like what is that about, right? And I think this is a way of him responding to Christian Zionism, which basically talks about Judeo-Christian, and instead saying that it's Judaism against Christianity. And part of what he does also, and this is, I don't want to talk about this publicly, but I think that there is a lot to worry about the way this right-wing discourse about Israel is going to shape the discourse of Haredim and ultra-Orthodox Jews in the United States. There is a tidal wave coming, I fear, in which, and you can see Carlson already doing it, the discourse that the way they talk about Somalis in Minneapolis is the way they're starting to talk about ultra-Orthodox Jews. It is the discourse of culturally alien people who don't share our values, who steal our money, right? And that literally, that discourse brought us Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis. It was that discourse. And that discourse can travel very, very easily. And Carlson has already started doing it. If you look at the way he had a whole program about Lakewood, about Kiryas Yoel, and it's going to be very, very problematic and difficult. And so this is, I think, part of what's, and I think the reason it's important to point that out is that that's not even about Zionism, right? That's about the idea that there are real Americans, good Americans, authentic heritage Americans who don't steal money. Carlson says in one of these videos, the Amish don't act like the Haredim do, right? Because we don't have Old Testament values where anything, as long as you follow the law, it's fine. We believe in a higher ethics, right? Like this is literally what he says in his conversation with this guy Oliveira who went to Lakewood and Kiryas Yoel, and that's going to be a really, really problematic. And that's not even an anti-Zionist right. That's basically a white nationalist right that is basically incorporating Jews into their white supremacist view. And this is what people like Ben Shapiro are realizing, I think, at their peril, which is to say, if you thought that you could basically make common cause with these people who were anti-black, anti-Muslim, racists, and that they were not going to get around to your people sooner or later, you were profoundly foolish.
Okay. Sir, I think you have a question.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Peter. You said that you're dealing with Palestinians that they're perfectly willing to live with Jews in Israel or in the binational state.
Well, it doesn't mean they support a binational state. Go ahead.
Okay, well, but perfectly willing to live side by side in peace. Hamas is a democratically elected terrorist organization whose platform was, not only are we going to destroy Israel, we're going to kill every Jew in it. Islamic Jihad believes the same thing. Hezbollah believes the same thing. And within the PLO, the Palestinian Authority within Islamic Jihad, the largest organization in Palestinian Authority believes in the same thing. So what are you basing your belief that the Palestinians will be kumbaya once we're given a binational state?
So I think one thing that's, Palestinians in occupied territories have not been able to hold elections since 2005. I think the group of Palestinians who are most consistently allowed to vote, ironically, are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? The quote-unquote Arab Israelis. And so, and we can see actually who they vote for, right? And the parties that they vote for are actually far more committed to the principle of liberal democracy than the party that Israeli Jews vote for, right? They vote for Hadash and they vote for Balad. And ironically, they vote for Aram, an Islamist party, right? It's also an Islamist party along with Hamas, right? But it's actually an Islamist party that is perfectly comfortable working with, it's actually in some ways the least liberal of the Palestinian parties, right? But it's actually also the most moderate, right? Because it's basically kind of like a Booker T. Washington party, which basically just is trying to, if they kind of operating like Shas, basically just trying to bargain. Now, if we want to talk about Hamas and the elections, I think it's important to try to keep, to have a number of different things in our head. The 1987 charter, Hamas's first charter, was absolutely an anti-Semitic document. It's also batshit crazy conspiratorial document that talks about the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? We cannot talk about the 1980s. I think it's totally legitimate for people to talk about the 1987 charter. What's not legitimate or intellectually honest is to not acknowledge that Hamas came up with a new charter in 2017, which is not an anti-Semitic document. It's an Islamist document. It's not a blueprint for the politics I would want. But I would encourage you to read both the 87 charter and the 2017 charter. The 2017 charter very explicitly distinguishes between Zionists, Zionism, and Jews, as many Palestinians, most Palestinians do. The 2005 election.
Okay, I just want to. So what you're saying is that the people who support Hamas in 2023 had no problem with Jews; they just had problems with the Israelis.
No. Okay. Well, let me answer that, and let me go back to 2005-11, and then let's then another two questions. The armed resistance against Israel is not an Islamist position, right? I just think it's important to make. I just mentioned to you that the most moderate Palestinian party in Israel proper is an Islamist party. Most of the violence that's been committed against Israelis, including against Israeli civilians, historically has not been committed by Islamists. One of the reasons that Israel supported Hamas when it was coming out of the Muslimhood in the 1980s was they saw Hamas as nonviolent because Islamists had not been involved in the violent actions of Palestinian factions in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Those were overwhelmingly committed by nationalist groups like Fatah and leftist groups like the PFLP and the DFLP. Arguably, perhaps one of the most radical and violent Palestinian factions in terms of killing Israeli Jewish civilians was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by George Kabash, a Greek Orthodox Christian who grew up singing in a choir, right? So I just think on October 7th, you know who else rushed through that fence and killed Israelis besides Hamas and Islamic Jihad? Members of the Fatah militia in Gaza, right? So the point is, there is a conversation about armed resistance and about the laws of war, and it is a war crime to target civilians, period. But the PLO, which was not an Islamist organization, did lots and lots of that. It's not about Islamism. That's a conversation about how Palestinians think they are going to win their freedom. And the best way in order to prevent Palestinians from trying to resist and win their freedom by killing Israeli civilians is showing that ethical resistance that abides by international law can succeed. My friend Mohammed Shahada, who I quote in my book, who grew up in Gaza, has a word to describe Palestinian politics. And the word he uses is experimental. In his argument, Palestinian politics is experimental, which means that Palestinians, like virtually every other group of people who face oppression, throw a lot of shit at the wall, just try to see what will work, right? And what Palestinians have seen is that their nonviolent efforts have been defeated and criminalized. Even their efforts at appeasement. The Palestinian national movement has done more appeasement than almost any other nationalist movement I can think of. If you had suggested to Jerry Adams of the IRA or, Oliver Tambo of the ANC, here's going to be our strategy. We're going to collaborate, work hand in glove with the military that is brutalizing us and denying us our rights for 20 years in the hopes that we will therefore show them that we can be trusted with our own rights, which is what the PA has been doing since the end of the Second Intifada. They would have thrown you out of the fucking room, right? That is what Mahmoud Abbas has been doing for 20 years. It's what Salam Fayyad was doing for 6 years. And even that got the Palestinians nothing. Fayyad said to Roger Cohen when he left Palestinian politics, I couldn't get the Israelis to stop settlement growth for a single day. Hamas is going to grow stronger. So when we want to have a conversation about armed resistance and the killing of Israeli civilians, which I never want to see an Israeli die, it's not a conversation about Islamism. It's a conversation about how we incentivize Palestinian resistance that's ethical. We can talk about the 2005 election. I'll just say on one foot, the 2005 election was an election that had not been an election for 10 years. If you look at Khalil Shakaki's exit polling of that election, the number one and two reason that people voted for Hamas were corruption. Again, Mohammed and others will tell you who are in Gaza. Basically the way that literally the Hamas leaders drove around in broken down cars and said, you see the cars that these guys at the PA have, right? They're corrupt. We're not corrupt. We run schools, we run clinics, we can be trusted, we're not corrupt. And secondly, these guys haven't gotten you very much, right? Their strategy hasn't worked so give us a try. The documents that the PA put out, Khalil Shrub has written about this. The documents that the PA ran on in those parliamentary elections didn't, for the most part, talk about destroying Israel. They basically said, these guys are sellouts. They in some ways said the same thing that Benjamin Netanyahu said against Shimon Peres, that basically they were friars. They got a bad deal. They were like, these people were such idiots that they conceded, they gave up they gave up on armed resistance, and they accepted Israel's right to exist. They didn't get a promise of a Palestinian state. They didn't even get a promise to end settlement growth, right? And they're corrupt. Right? And so give us a try. The majority of Hamas voters in the 2005 elections, Hamas voters said they supported a two-state solution.
But they voted for a party that called for the destruction of the state of Israel.
They voted for a party that opposed two states, just like the people who elected Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996.
Right.
Yeah. And have elected Netanyahu ever since. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can talk more.
Yeah, we could get it. Yeah. I don't know.
I want to move on. We got a question about Land for All,
Yeah.
which is this new political movement in Israel. Do you want to? What are your thoughts?
Sure. I think as Recline just did an interview them, which is great. I think Land for All is. I think Land for All is great. I think that the devils are always in the details here, and I think that the question about what exactly does it mean for have Palestinians, for instance, who can return to places that are in Israel proper, but then be citizens of a Palestinian state next door. I think there are a lot of questions one has to ask about that. But to me, the basic idea that wherever Jews and Palestinians are living next to one another, they should live under the same law, right? And there should be an effort to respond to historical injustice. That, it seems to me, is exactly the right principle. And so whether you respond for that in the way that Land for All does, or I think we can let 1,000 flowers bloom and have different conversations about different kinds of ways of making that principle work. But to me, what's important is the principle.
Do you have recommendations for reaching out to people whom you are close with and disagree with you and are too traumatized by October 7th to listen?
I mean, look, I think the first thing I would say is that I think it's okay to have relationships with people where you don't talk about this issue. It's just okay. They're people you love. They're people that are important to you. And the conversation is not going to change their mind. It's just it's going to undermine the relationship. And life is about more than politics. And you have the rest of your week to basically spend your time trying to be engaged in conversations which are going to be more productive in terms of changing American policy and moving towards, equality and justice. So I think it's a legitimate position. If people are willing to talk, my advice would be, and again, I'm not saying that this always works for me. My advice would be never have those conversations electronically. Have them in person. I don't do this as much, but I used to almost have a set time on Shabbat afternoon where I would walk, around the reservoir in Central Park with people who thought my views on Israel were terrible. And it went better than if we had been texting about it, and I think that, and start by listening. And try to not just listen to the arguments, but try to listen to the life experiences that people have had that have led them to those views. And then try to explain the things that you have seen and experienced that have led you to your views. Try not to get into, although it's hard, down into a lot of cul-de-sacs about various different obscure little, points. And then if there's an opportunity, ask that person if they would be willing to have a conversation with a Palestinian. Because the problem with these inter-Jewish conversations is that they always end up putting you as the lefty Jew into the position of the surrogate Palestinian. Why? I mean, literally, people will ask me, it's like, why are the Palestinians doing this? Can't you tell the Palestinians to do that? I'm like, you out of your mind? Right? The point is that in some ways only a Palestinian, you have to hear from a Palestinian. And I ideally not one and not 5 and not 10, but many, many people in order to be able to see the world through Palestinian eyes, have an understanding of how brutal the experience of Zionism in Israel has been for Palestinians, and also be able to actually start to challenge your own assumptions that are deeply rooted for many, many of us, that Palestinians have some inclination to want to hate and kill Jews, right? I think for many, many Jews, if they find they talk to one Palestinian who doesn't seem to believe that way, they're going to say, okay, that's a black swan event, right? That person's a little weird, right? And then they have 2 and 3 and 4. It's also like going to the West Bank and thinking the first thing you see that doesn't seem to have any security rationale, you say, well, that's an aberration. And then when you see more and more and more brutality that doesn't seem to have any rational, genuine security rationale to it, you begin to think maybe my paradigm is wrong, right? And I think that's a long road. It's been a long road for me. It's one of the things I admire about many people younger. I think you moved that road much faster. But I think we need to try to help people take the first step down that road.
What advice can you offer to pro-Palestinian American Christians who are called anti-Semitic for their advocacy? And how can Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Hindus support each other?
Did I answer that one maybe already?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Have a question?
Just a follow-up question on the Roman Catholic thing. I wonder if you think that there's, I don't know if danger is the right word, but in this argument of saving Zionism through getting Israel to be more acceptable to the world, right? You have that thing where he was you're not, no one's to buy your stuff, you're not this anymore, you're not that anymore, and you're gonna get sanctioned on this and that. If it gets Israeli politics to maybe change in some noteworthy way, but that then actually strengthens Israel on the world stage because it's no longer a pariah. Just in terms of that being the root that it seems him and Hakeem Jeffries, whatever these Cory Booker types of Democrats are well, this is the same way to do it. Is that a win for us? Is that actually one step forward, two steps back?
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you answered the question. I'm trying to write something about this. The problem, it seems to me, with what Rahm Emanuel is doing is he is changing his view in some way of Israel, but he's not rethinking his view of Palestinians. And he's not operating within a discourse in which Palestinians should have the right to articulate the way in which they want to vindicate their rights. And he's kind of, if you read between the lines, he's basically saying, we're going to control Palestinian politics. Maybe we're going to get the Saudis and the Emiratis to do it. And basically Israel will go a little bit this way, we'll get Israel, and then we'll force them. Now that actually is in some ways the story of Oslo, right? And it's part of the reason Oslo failed. So I think that the really critical missing piece, if I were to talk to people who, to say is the sanctions on Israel can be important, and I would obviously probably go further than Rahm Emanuel in them. But the other critical thing is we have to use these sanctions, this pressure on Israel, to allow Israel to allow Palestinians to have politics. In South Africa, or even in Northern Ireland, you had these political movements that represented people who were being oppressed, and they were able to lay out a vision, and they had some legitimacy, and then you could talk to them. We don't have that in the Palestinian case, and we won't have it unless Palestinians can choose their leaders. And that's complicated, because that means both elections, I think, in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. And it also means an umbrella organization that the PLO used to be, which can represent even Palestinians who are not in Israel and Palestine, but who were refugees in refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and stuff. And only when you have that can you then have the legitimate Palestinian voice that can sit down alongside Israel.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank everyone for coming, and shout out EY for letting us use her apartment. And thank you to Peter for this important conversation.
Thank you.
Before we go, some upcoming events in the next couple of weeks. First, we're recruiting for Protect the Harvest, which is an international effort to provide protective presence for the Palestinian olive harvest this fall in the West Bank. We're having an info session this coming Wednesday, July 15th at 12:30 p.m. The organizers are doing this specifically for us to address Shabbos and Kashrus-related questions. It will also be recorded if you can't make it. For the third year, we're hosting a Tisha B'Av program over Zoom on the afternoon of Thursday, July 23rd, Shiurim, followed by a screening of The Zone of Interest. We hope you'll join us. You can find links to register to either of those events on our Substack. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. Don't forget, that's the email from Minyan Mechav if you want to join us for some davening and Kiddush on Saturday.
Put up on the door over there so you can get
Yes, yes.